And our third speaker is Reverend Bonnie Rambob. Bonnie was raised as a Seventh-day Adventist and educated in Seventh-day Adventist schools. But her path of personal discovery led Bonnie to process philosophy and to open and relational theology. After completing her religious training at Pacific School for the Religion, she accepted a position as parish minister for the United Church of Christ. Good job.
I could put that on the speedometer.
However, the recent COVID pandemic caused her to reevaluate her sense of calling. Bonnie realized that her talents were needed during this critical shortage of teachers. So for the last 2 years, she's been teaching kindergarten in the Galt Unified School District of Metropolitan Sacramento. She currently co-hosts 2 podcasts for progressive Christians, and recently co-edited the book, Partnering with God, which I think you can find over there. Bonnie will be the featured speaker next Tuesday for the Cobb Institute online series. Bonnie spends her free time, God knows where she finds it, with her partner and 2 sons, climbing trees, hiking, and knitting. Bonnie's paper this afternoon is titled Proximity and Relational Learning Communities, a process perspective on social presence. Please welcome Reverend Bonnie Rambob.
Thank you. It's truly an honor to be here and to be able to share with you. I am grateful to the visionaries, John Cobb and Marjorie Suhaki and others who thought of this idea for Center for Process Studies, and then to those who continue to hold it and carry it into the future. I've heard some people say that they walk around with their mother's voice in their heads. I suppose that could be one way of prehending the past into the becoming subject. I walk around with my children's voices in my head, calling for a new future, far different from the one they fear they will inherit. Calling for a revolution that just might turn the tables on what Mama Ruby Sales calls the capitalist technocratic world that we've given them over to. And there are many children's voices in my head, my own children, my nieces, and hundreds of kids from various school and youth ministry settings that I've had the privilege to work in. Currently, I am working in my local public school as kindergarten teacher. And it's different than the settings of my colleagues up here on the panel. And I invite you to come with me into my classroom, my kindergarten classroom, where I have 26 5- and 6-year-olds, and to visit with me an occasion that happened in the not too recent past. As the teacher who directs the program, I have the profound opportunity to trouble the collective curiosity that is always churning in my classroom. And I get to offer the experience of learning like an invitation to the best birthday party ever. So back in October, for example, this is a learning occasion that I want to bring you into. I placed 3 whole pumpkins on a table in the center of the room, a table something like this. And I asked my students, out of these 3 pumpkins, which one do you think has the most seeds? It is not difficult to get kindergartners to take the lure that I was offering. Hands instantly shoot up to the sky, and the ideas that emanated from their minds were palpable through their excited eyes. And as I called on my students, I heard ideas like, the tallest pumpkin has the most seeds, or the pumpkin with the largest stem has the most seeds, the heaviest pumpkin, etc. Then I had already placed kids, my students, in learning teams, smaller learning communities, and I distributed pumpkins that were cut in half into each of these learning teams. And I asked them to notice how seeds grew inside the pumpkin. And it wasn't long before a group of learners realized that the shell on the outside, where there's an indented line, on the inside, there's a row of seeds. And the more indented lines on the outside of the pumpkin, the more seeds there would be on the inside of the pumpkin. And just like that, the joyful news of this guided discovery quickly spread through that gathered social network. And from that moment on, those minds will always know how to spot a seedy pumpkin without having to cut it open. And thus, learning transfers from one human to another, as it always has done since we've been human. Based on discourse in the fields of education, biology, process philosophy, and anthropology, I fashioned my paper's proposal around the following assumptions. 1, learning is primarily a social endeavor. 2, learning can be more intense when it happens within diverse social relationships. 3, learning occurs in the relational space between learners, and thus it is co-offered and co-incorporated into each learner's knowing by the learner's agency. 4, in learning community, the roles of teacher and student often intersect and overlap, resulting in mutual learning and growth. 5, human development is an essential consideration when designing relational learning communities. For example, beyond cognitive abilities, the social engagement of an infant differs greatly from that of a 12-year-old child or a 50-year-old adult. And the last assumption, social presence, which I define as an inner posture of reaching out to another for interaction, and social engagement, which I define as a relational dynamic along the spectrums of listening, speaking, watching, doing, waiting, doing, watching, showing, and the dynamic of co-experience through play are foundations to relational learning communities. If educators were to take social relational necessity in learning for granted, in our current educational landscape, we might wrestle with questions like, what are the qualifications for the term social or relational? Can we foster the kind of social presence and social engagement needed for optimal learning through Zoom classes, online asynchronous classes, social media, and other technological means? And how does proximity affect social presence and social engagement? How might we envision social proximity in a global, technologically connected society? Is there a hierarchy of social quality within different configurations of relational learning communities? Like in-person is better than Zoom, for example. I'm not against technology. I am against antisocial uses of technology. By applying the societal element of Whitehead's thought system when thinking about social learning, we can explore new dimensions of what social might look like and how it might work. Using Whitehead, we could say, each learner in each moment of their own becoming process prehends the other socially connected learners and teachers who are also in their own processes of becoming. The relational learning community is an ongoing networked web of sharing in each other's constitution, which in each iteration of momentary process creates new possibilities for near or distant future moments of becoming subjects. Thus, learning is making oneself and others within a networked community. When learners gather in groups, they bring their social presences, their desire to connect, as well as their desire to know, to the table of learning. They reach toward each other with desires for deeper knowledge of themselves, each other, and the world. Learning as social interaction is a kind of spiraling give and take exchange fostered by an inner yearning to reach out as one with something to offer, while desiring the effect of the offerings of others in oneself. And each interaction between learners, teachers, and I think those lines are blurry, changes the ones doing the interacting moment by moment. New iterations of themselves are not just given for the individuals that are directly involved in the interaction, but also for the other learners in the community associated by social proximity and solidarity. In the Whiteheadian system, the possibilities made available through social interactions between a group of learners in a particular learning community are accessible to all future becomings. In using the concept of prehension as a thought framework for relational learning communities, the integrity of the individual particularity is retained. Each learner is an individual entity in relationship with and to the other learners in the community. There's no melting pot here where one disappears into the other. And absorption does not allow for social presence or social engagement. However, the learning community as a whole unified society does have its own life, its own process of becoming that is different than the sum of its parts. The group is its own entity with its own transcendent possibilities calling to the future. In a sense, at the societal level, there's a kind of alchemy that occurs. The learning community can transcend itself as a whole. The community's transcendent quality lies beyond the bonds of common characteristics shared by its individual members. The transcendence lies in the socially networked, moment-by-moment processes themselves, each process involving particular prehensions between particular members in relation to each other and to the whole as a whole. What is possible to the future from the learning that occurs within a social learning environment depends on the composition of the individual learners in this webbed relational process in particular moments of time. Truly, everything matters. The individual learners matter. How the group is comprised matters. Social proximity matters. The flow of time matters. What happens as each learning process unfolds matters. All this matters to what is possible in the future. Yes. Your garden variety classroom teacher is fluent in this understanding. And side note, I really think garden variety as a descriptor should be reclaimed as an honorific. With earnest, conscious intent, teachers regularly experiment with spatial and temporal configurations to meet the learning needs of their students. Somehow, teachers simultaneously hold individual learners in mind in relation to the whole learning community as they discern moment by moment the best spatial configurations, the best social learning groupings, the best sequencing of proposed learning events, the transition from one event to the other, and all of that in relation to the larger and associated learning communities that might be present in the school. A teacher's desire to design the best spatial temporal configurations for her students is not born out of a desire to control learning. Most teachers are fully aware that they have very little coercive control over the prehending that goes on in their classrooms, either positively or negatively. In a Whiteheadian framework, each individual process of becoming decides for itself what it will become. Metaphorically, this level of agency translates to individual learners. The desire on an educator's heart that drives careful thought about crafting the dimensions of time-space relationality emerges from an understanding of the social. Humans are hyper-social creatures. Anthropologists tell us this. Even the biological construction of human brains may have been socially made. It is possible that our earliest linguistic abilities, unique to humans, co-emerged along with the gray matter of an expanding neocortex. Scientists across disciplines theorize that brain and language development seem to have a complex interplay. And beyond the neural structure required for the acquisition of language, renowned linguists such as George Lakoff tell us that our capacity to think thoughts is dependent on language, which is socially imparted from one generation to the next during specific windows of development. If language and thinking are inextricably linked, our thinking capacity is affected by our socialization. Therefore, the social, it's in our bones, it's in our brains, it's in us. Teachers intuit this, so do students. We, all humans, bring our social presence to communal spaces seeking social engagement with others. We yearn to connect, to belong to a social community so that we can be, so that we can know, so that we can help shape what's next. In this way, the there becomes here, becomes available to not yet. This is process, this is education. The first word in the title of my paper is proximity. And in its etymology, proximity is a word that encapsulates closeness and nearness in time, space, and in social relations. A synonym for proximity is akin. The word came into use in the English language during the Middle Ages, when it was likely employed to describe the nature of familial relations, as well as close relatedness of things in space and or time. Social bonds fit the category of proximate, identified as such by the relationships themselves, regardless of the spatial temporal arrangements of these relationships. So in theory, you know, my dead grandmother, who I was very close to, and I are in proximity to one another. The term proximity also includes a close positioning in time and or space. So in a Whiteheadian framework, the lure for feeling, which leads to subjective prehending, is based on relevance. In large part, relevant possibilities available for the becomer to prehend are made relevant by withness. Withness, encompassed in the word proximity, incorporates nearness in the dimensions of space, time, and social relationality. So in my paper, I attempt to propose a constructive and evaluative model for designing and evaluating curriculum and instructional practices, keeping with the process relational perspective, alongside the work of multiple researchers in fields of education and psychology. And right now, I don't have time to adequately report on the findings of the researchers that I cite in my paper. Each study is a fascinating exploration of social learning, which provides the model that I propose. In my model's design, the cultivation of social relationships is primary. In my view, curriculum and instructional practices should support the relational life of the learning community rather than the other way around. I propose cultivating a learning relational life around cultural values such as safety, truth, diversity, identity, emotional connection, and credibility. The specific expression of a relational learning culture would be specific to any given learning community. The model's goal is to bring intention to the relational social component of education at a time in human history in which old forms of social relational seem to be morphing into new forms without deeply thinking about the social and relational needs of human beings. As a side note, I've learned that many kids view social relational dynamics as commodities rather than as spiritual or emotional wells of support, belonging, and meaning-making. And we've taught them this. Our kids have never been more socially networked and yet so lonely. Schools have spent a lot of money on SEL, social and emotional learning, to help kids learn about self-awareness and relationships. In my own district, the SEL curriculum involves short videos and worksheets that teachers are supposed to fit into their learning at least once a week. And for a long time, public schooling has not honored the social presence of each learner, nor has it encouraged social engagement, even though we've known since the beginning of time humans learn through social interaction. So I know I'm making a radical proposal. We live in a world that demands input-output systems of everything. Education policymakers follow suit. And the relational component of learning is often relegated to happy coincidence or an afterthought. Currently, the educational norm, at least in the public sector, is to standardize everything: curriculum, instructional methods, and assessment tools. Learning standards are externally imposed rather than shaped from within the learning community in a social dynamic. I strongly agree with Alfred North Whitehead, who insists, quote, "One train of thought will not suit all groups of children," end quote. So here we are in the midst of big change because of the global pandemic in 2020. And I just wonder, what would happen if we took the learning that we got from the experience in the pandemic, particularly with education? And, Zoom school was a nightmare for most young children and parents and teachers. But what if we just took the learning that we got from that experience and we begin to consider the relational aspects of learning? What if we began with the who before considering curriculum and instruction, the what and how? When we carefully consider relational learning, cultural values, human development, and social proximity, could technological tools help us enhance relational learning? Is it possible that appropriate relational learning settings could include things like Zoom, Discord, Google Classroom, other networking technologies? So I know my proposal is incomplete. It's an incomplete cry for fundamentally rethinking how we do education, using process and relational frameworks. And it's not just my cry, it's the cry of the children's voices in my head. And more research is needed, more conversations need to happen, and ultimately, I suppose the proposal is a bit selfish because I just want to be able to tell the children in my sphere, like I'm sure you do as well, that I'm trying. And that's it.